We started our first session last week, for those who were able to be with us, with some biography of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And we are going to focus in on the latter part of his life tonight, and particularly his involvement with the civil rights and anti-war movement that became one of the defining features of his legacy, the way in which he brought together a deep Hasidic Eastern European spirituality and a seriousness of Jewish practice, together with a significant social conscience and a commitment to activism beyond simply statements and declarations, but onto the street. We are going to start by watching a few minutes from Heschel's final interview, which he gave to NBC's Carl Stern just a couple of weeks before his death from a heart attack. And in that interview, which I hope throughout this study group, we will watch different clips and selections of. The selection I have teed up is talking about the way in which his doctoral work, which you may remember was on the prophets, written in the 1930s in Germany, ultimately published by a Polish publisher in 1936, and then republished as a study beyond the dissertation for all of us under the name The Prophets in the 1960s. And he talks about the way in which spending time studying and writing about the prophets transformed his life and his set of priorities and commitments. And I want to watch this first because I think it helps to set the stage for what's to come. And second, because I want us to have Heschel's face and his voice in our ears and eyes and minds as we are studying. He brings incredible teaching, but he is himself a remarkable personality, and that comes through best in watching him. So I'm going to share with you a piece from this interview, again given in the weeks just before Heschel's death. And we are queued up with a discussion he's having about the state of race in America in 1972.
As a person committed to biblical faith, I would say what keeps humanity alive is the certainty that we have a Father. But then I suppose I have to remember that God is either the Father of all men or of no men. And the idea of judging a person in terms of black or brown or white is an eye disease.
You've also said that you're an optimist against your better judgment.
Yeah.
But you're still an optimist.
I'm still an optimist.
You first gained prominence as a scholar writing about the prophets. Is it possible for a modern prophet to come to us? Or is that just pre-biblical?
Again, Mr. Stern, your questions are very rich and very complex and very meaningful. And since time is so limited and precious, I will have to give you short answers and only partial answers. The idea of a prophet is complex and consists above all of two things, or the message or the substance of what the prophet has to say, of some extraordinary claim to an experience which is not given to other men. Let us ignore the second, let us take the first. What's so great about the message of the prophet? But the prophet is a character. I would say the prophet is a man who is able to hold God and man in one thought at one time, at all times. This is so great and this is so marvelous, which means that whatever I do to man, I do to God. When I hurt a human being, I injure God. No, their thoughts, their message continues to be so relevant today that I venture to say, and I had this experience with many distinguished philosophers when we got together to discuss social contemporary problems, that the ultimate source of hope for all of us, whether it was Protestant or Catholic or secular philosopher, was suddenly a reliance on a hope uttered by the prophets of Israel. Therefore, I would say the spirit of the prophet, the message of the prophet is very much alive. The kind of men who combined very deep love with very powerful dissent, painful rebuke with unwavering hope. The prophet as a witness to that great mystery, or to what I would call meaning beyond the mystery, namely God, could still be alive and should serve as an example.
Are you talking about a rebirth of their knowledge in the mouths of others, or is that not to be?
No, an identification. May I make a personal statement here? I've written a book on the prophets, a rather large book, spent many years. And then really this book changed my life. Because early in my life, my great love was learning, study. And the place where I preferred to live was my study in books and writing and thinking. I've learned from the prophets that I have to be involved in the affairs of men, in the affairs of suffering men. And I would like to say that one of the saddest things about contemporary life in America is that the prophets are unknown. There's a complete decline of the Bible in American education. No one knows the prophets. There are countless intellectuals who may be great authorities on literature. I've never read the prophets really, never been touched by them. And this, I'm sorry to say, is a little bit of a disaster. The great examples we need today are the ancient prophets of Israel. I say that this book on the prophets which I wrote changed my life. And I think that anybody who reads the prophets will discover, number one, that the prophets were the most disturbing people who've ever lived. Yeah? It's not easy to read.
You mean they were abrasive when you say disturbing?
Abrasive, disturbing, giving me a bad conscience.
Are you a prophet? You've been abrasive at times, particularly concerning the Vietnam War. You've said a great deal about that.
I wouldn't accept this praise, because it's enough for me to say that I am a descendant of the prophets, which is an old Jewish statement. It is claim almost arrogant enough to say that I am a descendant of the prophets, what is called B'nai Nevi'im. So let us hope and pray that I'm worthy of being a descendant of the prophets.
You said during the height of
Really special to hear his words. And his response to that final question, are you a prophet? I wouldn't call myself a prophet, but I am in the lineage of prophets. I am the child of a prophet, of the prophets. In fact, one of the repeated lines from the Hasidic tradition, from the Eastern European mystical tradition from which Heschel descends, is this idea that the most terrible thing that our Yetzer Hara, our evil or selfish inclination, our bad angel on our shoulder can do to us is to cause us to forget that we are the children of the sovereign. That the worst thing that the Yetzer Hara can do to us is cause us to forget our nobility, that we are the descendants of a holy line that ultimately goes back to the first parent, to God. And that's where Heschel started in his interview. Either God is the father of all or of none. And so that idea of trying to carry forward a noble lineage, not believing oneself to be a prophet or believing oneself to be God, but recognizing that it's all in the family, I think is a really powerful orientation toward the world. I'll just open up for a few people, if you'd like, to share any initial reactions to hearing Heschel speak, or any of the things that he says about the way in which studying the prophets changed him, and his belief that it is vital that we as a culture look back to the prophets in order to find hope in difficult times. invite anybody who wants to share a reflection. I'm hoping we'll do a lot in breakout groups, but sometimes in a big group. If you can use the raise hand function, that's going to make things a lot easier in a big group. And would be happy to have a few people share reflections. And you can put them in chat if you'd like, and I'll read things aloud. But it would be great to hear your voices, just like we heard Heschel's.
Rabbi, it looks like Beth Crum has her hand up.
Oh, here you go. Beth, if you'd like to unmute.
Thank you. You know, I also was doing some reading, and Heschel speaks about his feelings about Jewish education and Jewish synagogue life in America. And, you know, I feel like it would have been wonderful if I had learned about the prophets when I was in Hebrew school. Like, I feel like there's so much in Judaism that would have been such a powerful stamp on my heart and my heritage. And so, you know, I appreciate his observation that, you know, sometimes in the institutional way in which religion is, you know, presented in modern life, you know, we've lost touch with it. And, you know, some people may have been in synagogues where they did learn the prophets, but I didn't. So
Thank you. For those who don't know her, that's Mayor Beth Crum, former mayor of the city of Irvine, a wonderful justice leader here in Orange County, a really powerful and prophetic inspired voice in my own life, and sharing what I think many of us have as a shared experience, which is that if we received a Jewish education as a child, it may have been an annual recitation of the holidays. Okay, we're learning the story of Hanukkah, Purim, and Passover again, and a memorization of how to read words phonetically that we didn't fully understand. And this wealth of inspiring, hope-filled, and challenging material was not necessarily made available to us. I'll hope that we'll do a little bit better in the Jewish education that we're giving our kids here at CBI. I'll share that I just got back from Washington, D.C. For 4 days, bringing 5 of our teens to D.C. on a new program sponsored by the conservative movement called Ruchot. It was a program where they spent 3 days learning about social issues, about immigration, about reproductive rights, about climate, about Israel and other things, culminating in a set of lobby trips to the Hill, where they met with the offices of both of our California senators and 2 representatives and got to share their voices. And that felt very much like a culminating activity to their Jewish education. These are juniors and seniors here in our community, helping them to recognize that they are the inheritors of a tradition of people who go out and make good trouble and who use their voice and values to make a difference. Aaron, you'll go next, and then we'll turn to Judge Goldberg.
I think something that stood out, or I guess a line of that interview that stood out to me, is when he said that as a young man, he was so enthralled and invested in his studies, and that studying the prophets kind of pulled him out of that and made him realize that you have to be concerned with man and with the suffering of man. And I think I'll echo similarly that while, you know, my Hebrew school maybe touched on prophets, that is not, if you had asked me 2 hours ago what I would take away from prophets, I would not have thought of that aspect of the prophets. And the fact that he takes our tradition and says it's important not just to study it, but then to do it and to act and stand up for the suffering of man. I just thought that was very poignant.
Thank you, Aaron. There's a debate in the Talmud. There's always a debate in the Talmud. There's a debate in the Talmud between two rabbis about which is greater, study or action. One says study is greater because you need to know this tradition that we are the inheritors of. The other says action is more important because what we're judged on is what we put out into the world. And eventually they come together on the idea that study is essential, but only when it leads to action. That these aren't two separate categories, but rather two parts in a dance. That our study is supposed to then be translated into the way that we act in the world. I have a stender, a book stand that I used in rabbinical school. And one of the rituals of the third year of rabbinical school in Jerusalem is making your way to Mea Sharim, to the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem, and going to a particular little hole in the wall in one of those mazy alleys that makes stenders and that inscribes them with a verse of your choosing on the top. And I chose to have my stender inscribed with that line, Talmud mevi liyadei maaseh, study leads to action. And so when I rest my book on my book holder, and it's still sitting right there on my table in my office, that's the line that I choose to focus on. That anytime I'm opening a book, the value of that action of studying is in the way that I take those words and don't just tuck them away in the library of my mind, but have them translate into the way that I walk in the world with others. Judge Goldberg.
I'm Mitch. Don't put me on a pedestal. My question is how does that reflect on people who choose not to study the prophets or even think of themselves as Jewish? I reflect strongly on my twin brother, Michael, we were both raised Orthodox, but shortly after high school, he got involved in a lot of social action work in the early 60s, and remained in that environment all his life, found that religion and religious theology was antithetical because all it led to were wars and fights. And so he became an atheist. And yet he lived his full life as one of the most righteous people I'll ever know because he lived his entire life advocating for those in need and working in that field. And he practiced what he preached, though he didn't preach. He just practiced it. He practiced probably the highest levels of Judaism. They'd be very angry with me if I said that, because again, he was an atheist. So how does Heschel reconcile the quote, study the prophets and you'll learn how to be a quote, active, righteous person versus those people who are not, whether they be Jewish, whether they have any religion whatsoever, but engage in strong human interconnection? How do we reconcile that?
Yeah, I don't believe that Heschel believed it was a prerequisite to being a decent person in the world, to be religious or to be learned in these particular sources. Certainly he would recognize that there are many people out there doing the work of social justice, social change, extending a hand to their neighbors who are not learned in these texts and who are not religious in any classical or maybe even any sense of the word at all. And I think he was committed to the idea that religion is one of the tools and maybe one of the most powerful tools in the human toolkit for helping to inspire and deepen that work. It's not the only tool, it's not the only source or engine that could drive it, but it is a profoundly powerful one. And it is a valuable, I think he would say invaluable, arrow to have in your quiver. That faith strengthens activism and it strengthens resolve. And I think we have seen that in so many of the great change makers, that they were driven by a sense of purpose and of responsibility and of duty that sometimes even involved laying down their own lives in pursuit of those values. And in order to get to a place where one is prepared to sacrifice that much, I think one needs to have a faith commitment, whether that's faith in God or that's faith in ideas or that's faith in humanity. There has to be a driving source of strength to make somebody capable of the acts of nobility that some people seem to be able to rise to. So I don't think Heschel was here criticizing atheists or criticizing irreligious people. I think he would certainly recognize his kinship with anybody who is out doing the work. And I think he would argue to your brother that his commitment and capacity would only be strengthened by being able to be plugged into a legacy of change makers and inspiring people over the course of history, to which your brother may or may not have agreed, which is always allowed in Jewish sources. Laurel Paley, please share with us.
Well, about Jewish education and Hebrew school and not learning the prophets, I think pretty much most Jewish people who will have any relationship at all with any synagogue or prayer service, they're going to show up on Yom Kippur. And on Yom Kippur, the Haftarah is the very famous, is this the fast you think I want from you, that you should like not eat and you should don sackcloth and ashes? No, the fast I want from you is that you clothe the naked and you cover, you take care of the widow and the orphan. And so I actually think we might be doing a touch bit better about, the values of the prophets than maybe we've said. I agree, one should be studying them to whatever extent we're studying. But I did grow up in a synagogue with Harold Schulweis as the rabbi. And every other week it was another social action thing, a new committee that does this and a new committee that does that. We had so much going on and so many ways to make change emanating out of Schulweis's kind of pushing the congregation, a pretty well-to-do, fat and happy congregation, to take what they had and do great things with it and make a difference in the city and in the world. And so I do think, like right now, I attend and I'm a member of ECAR, and I do think there are congregations that are pressing for change and perhaps using the prophets, perhaps not, but in the spirit of the values that the prophets were promulgating.
Absolutely, right. These are teachings that are hidden in plain sight. If we attend a Shabbat service, we read a selection from the prophets every single week. That's the Haftarah. It's not, by the way, the half Torah. I always thought we read the Torah and the half Torah, literally till I got to college. Haftarah is just an Aramaic word that means a portion or a selection. We read a prophetic selection. Sadly, though, what is the primary activity that takes place during the Haftarah? The primary activity that takes place during the Haftarah is going to the bathroom. That is the ideal moment in the service when people get up and stretch. In our community, go and get a cup of coffee, go schmooze outside. It's a long chunk of Hebrew being chanted and it is very easy to miss the prophetic charge that is being offered every week.
Or getting the candy ready to throw at the bar mitzvah.
Exactly. And I have to wonder if there isn't, at some subconscious level, an avoidance that goes beyond this is just a convenient time to go and get your coffee or go to the bathroom. Maybe there is some part of us that skips out at the time that we are about to hear a charge to stepping up our moral behavior. Maybe there is some piece of us that might resist that just a little bit. I don't know. But yes, it is all there. And there are amazing teachers like Rabbi Harold Schulweis of blessed memory, like Sharon Brous at ECAR, where I am also still a member, and where I had the privilege of working in my first job out of rabbinical school, and many others who are leading from the prophets. But it is a truth that a great many Jews and others have not been as fully exposed as we might hope to these texts, and I think we're hearing that. people saying, I know it's there, but actually, I don't know that I ever spent that much time. Rebecca, you had your hand raised, and I see you
Yeah,
unmuted.
this relates to two of our previous participants, Beth and the last. We think of the prophets as Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Yechezkel, and they are heavy and wordy and difficult. But the 12 prophets, known in English as the minor prophets, have the same message essentially. They're much easier to read. And I think the last quote from Yom Kippur was from one of those prophets. I'm not sure. Nonetheless, I think if any of us want to delve into the prophets, it would do us well to look into the 12 prophets that are shorter books and still convey a very strong message.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yes, the Haftarah that was mentioned for Yom Kippur is actually from Isaiah, from the longest, but it is one of Isaiah's more straightforward and accessible statements. He lays it right out there on the line. He says, is this the fast that I desire? A day for mortifying one's body, a day for sitting and suffering. No, the fast I desire is to go out and break the chains of every yoke and to set the oppressed free. He lays it all out there, no metaphors and fancy language. But I agree that Isaiah and Jeremiah can be quite intimidating, and there are more pithy prophets. I'm a big fan of Amos and Micah in particular. And of course, on Yom Kippur, we read one of those minor prophets, the prophet Jonah, who talks about how we can always change and change for the better. Chuck, if you'd like to share.
Talking about atheists, there's a Hasidic teaching that says we should respect the atheist because the atheist does good things without any thought of future reward.
Thank you. Howard.
You're muted, Howard.
Here I go. Yeah, thank you. I want to argue for Isaiah, and of all the major prophets, I get a great deal of perspective out of Isaiah. And I think that if you're going to try to do good in this world, rather try to do more good than bad, because nobody can do absolute good, right? You have to have a perspective that you're not the most important thing in the universe, right? You have to have the perspective that there are many, many things that are more important than you, and that what gives your life meaning is that you try to make those, to put yourself, in a sense, behind your responsibilities to the rest of society and to nature and to all these things. Because if you're the most important person in the world and everybody feels that way, well, everything's going to go to hell in a handbasket. So it's only by cooperating together to solve problems that we end up making things better and achieve a result that nobody could achieve if everybody were only out there for themselves, like Hillel says, right? So I look at Isaiah, and there's one line that always grabs me, and I forget which chapter it is, but it's the one where he says, have you not been told, have you not seen it from the beginning, describing God? He sits above the circle of the earth, and look up at the star, look, raise your eyes and see, meaning to the heavens. Who made these? Meaning all the stars and galaxies and things. And I think to myself, whenever I read that, I say, whatever problems I have, whatever issues I'm facing, let's put these in perspective of a much larger context. That God is working in a hugely vast complex, and all we can do is try to be nice to each other. And I think you got to have that perspective, and that's what Isaiah gives you in order to do what Heschel's asking us to do. I don't know, that's just me.
Beautifully said. Right? The prophets offer us perspective on what really matters. Religion is supposed to offer us perspective on what really matters, and to get us out of centering ourselves and to center something higher. This is the incredible wisdom of the recovery world. And I see Henriette, who has written 2 wonderful books about that, joining us from our neighbor to the north, soon to be the 51st state of the United States of America. And you know, she could teach us all about the wisdom of the spiritual tradition of recovery. But what little I know is that healing starts when we learn how to take ourselves out of the center of our consciousness and to find something bigger than ourselves that's worth living for, and worth healing for. And that can be God in the traditional capital G sense, and that can be God in a much more interpretive and personal sense. But we are able to walk in the world with integrity when we recognize that we are, at very least, not the biggest and the most important thing here. One of my teachers, Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller, says, the only thing I need you to believe about God is that you're not. The only thing I need you to believe about God is that you're not. So long as you believe that there is something bigger than you, you are in the conversation. And Heschel is very much teaching us that we are tremendously important, that human beings play a tremendous role. One of his most famous books of theology, after all, is God in Search of Man, that God needs us as God's partner, but we are also not God. So thank you for that. Sharon, I'll give you the last word in this conversation, and then I want to turn us to a little bit of the timeline of Heschel's involvement in civil rights and anti-war work. Sharon, you're muted. Sharon, you're still muted. This is when a Zoom session is like a seance. You're not coming through.
Okay, there you
go. There you go.
I wanted to say that it seems to me that a problem that people have in society is simply that anything prophetic sounding like an oracle or something that's hard to understand that is still calling them to take action is relegated to poetry in order for people to even decide that they're going to digest it somewhat. And so that if a person makes statements that seem like they're calling on something that isn't just here's your instructions for the day, and it does go with a lot of Jewish people too, or religious or non-religious. It just becomes something that they can't deal with. And it's very unfortunate because I almost thought when Heschel was speaking that he was saying that the prophets should be part of education in general. Well, what we get instead is polemics by Greek philosophers or something like that about how you should conduct yourself in society. And that's considered okay. But something that is trying to get to your soul and your heart in that sense, even if it is not of a particular religion, is again, unless it's literature and you can look at it like that and you go, oh, that's just a bunch of fluff, just doesn't mean anything to most people. It's a very sad condition for us to be in.
And Heschel is urging us to do better.
Mm-hmm.
Heschel is urging us to do better and is recognizing that in his own life, while immersed in Jewish text and wisdom from his beginning, he only came to take seriously this sense of responsibility to translate study into action through the happenstance of coming to engage with the prophets in his doctoral work. And that was the key that unlocked so much of what came next in his life and so much of what makes him such a remarkable teacher. So I want to share with you just a little bit about Heschel's involvement in justice causes. This is what we talked about last week. First, going back, Heschel is raised in a deeply insular world. He's raised in the world of the pre-war shtetl in Poland. He is raised completely surrounded by Jews, and not only Jews, but Hasidic Jews of a particular kind. It's not until he gets to high school, when he goes to the gymnasia in Vilna, and then college, when he goes to Berlin, that he has the unique experience for somebody with his background of encountering the non-Jewish world. Even so, he might very well have encountered the broader world and then seen what that world did to him and to his people and to his family, and retreated from anything other than the closed circle of his people. But instead, even from the vantage point of being a professor in a Jewish seminary, writing about Jewish topics, Heschel becomes involved from the early 1960s, consciously in interfaith work, consciously in reaching out beyond our particular community and to engage with a larger, broader spiritual faith community. It's in November of 1961 that, as we talked about last week, Heschel is selected by the American Jewish Committee to start meeting with the Catholic Church in the process that would culminate in Nostra Aetate. Nostra Aetate, the document issued as part of Vatican II, the Reformation of the Catholic Church in the 1960s, that completely changed the orientation of the largest Christian denomination in the world towards Jews. It is in Nostra Aetate that the church formally renounces the idea that Jews were responsible for the crime of deicide, the crime of killing Jesus. It is part of that declaration in which the church formally renounces its call to missionize and convert the Jews. It is a reorientation fundamentally in how the church see Jews not as sinners who rejected Jesus and who are blind to the truth, but rather as spiritual ancestors and as faith partners. And it is really one of the most hopeful stories, I think, in the history of religion which fairly can be condemned or at least criticized for contributing to so much intergroup violence, so much sense of superiority and supersessionism. This is one of the rare stories in the history of religion in which a religious tradition as a collective bends toward reconciliation and understanding in a profound and lasting way. I think we don't talk about how remarkable it is that the church engaged in this process, and particularly engaged in this process with us. And Heschel was at the very heart of it, involved in meeting with cardinals, educating them about Judaism, only less than 20 years after his family is murdered by many people who grew up Catholic in the Holocaust. And he plays a huge bridge building role there. That bridge building role is going to extend in 1963 when Heschel is introduced to Martin Luther King Jr. at the National Conference on Religion and Race. And he delivers a speech there called Religion and Race. I am hoping we will spend a significant amount of time in this study group going through and reading carefully. It is a truly prophetic document, and for better or for worse, and largely for worse, just as relevant today as it was when it was written in 1963. Heschel's relationship with King continues throughout the rest of King's life, and he is a close confidant and advisor. Heschel is a participant in the famous March from Selma. I was told by my friend Corey, who was here, that actually this photo is mislabeled. This photo does not come from the March from Selma, but rather from the gathering at Arlington National Cemetery, which took place later, speaking out against the Vietnam War. You may be familiar with the image of Heschel in the front line together with Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy, and others, all wearing, for some reason, flower leis in the March from Selma in 1965. Heschel at that march was called upon to read a psalm. He read Psalm 27, which is the psalm that we read during the month of Elul, that begins, "The Lord is my God, who shall I fear?" Essentially going back to that point that we talked about when Mitch raised the question about the non-religious social activist, that Heschel believed very much that having a sense of loyalty to something bigger than ourselves helps to empower and strengthen us to do heroic things. And so reading that psalm that begins with this affirmation, I am, in the words of Hebrew National Hot Dogs, answerable to a higher authority. And that for me is a reason to face down Bull Connor and his dogs. That is a reason to face down the Klan. That is a reason to face down haters and bigots in every generation. Heschel is the one who is considered most responsible for encouraging Dr. King to become involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. There were a lot of voices that wanted Dr. King to not wade into that politically treacherous set of waters, to keep his focus exclusively on civil rights. It is in a series of conversations with Heschel, and then ultimately in a speech which Heschel helped to organize at the Riverside Church in New York, in which Dr. King links his involvement with domestic issues of justice with the necessity of speaking out for justice internationally and for the end to the Vietnam War. Heschel and King were involved deeply in the anti-war movement. Heschel was also involved with a number of leading Catholic figures, Father Berrigan and others, who were significant anti-war activists. In June of 1963, so after Heschel was introduced to King and spoke at the National Conference on Religion and Race, President Kennedy, who some of you listed as your inspiring change maker, convenes a gathering of several hundred religious leaders on the topic of race at the White House. Before that gathering, Heschel sends a telegram to President Kennedy with a line at the end that became then the title of a collection of Heschel essays edited by his daughter Susanna many years later, and could be very much considered, I think, a coda on this period of his life. And I'll read the telegram now as an invitation to think about this, and we'll turn back to it when we meet again next week. I look forward to the privilege of being present at meeting tomorrow. Likelihood exists that Negro problem will be like the weather. Everybody talks about it, but nobody does anything about it. I love that line, right? That everybody is aware that there is tremendous racial inequity in this country at this time, and everybody bemoans, or at least everybody of goodwill bemoans that problem, but many people treat it as simply an inescapable fact, just like the weather. Please demand, he writes, please demand of religious leaders personal involvement, not just solemn declaration. We forfeit the right to worship God as long as we continue to humiliate Negroes. Church, synagogue have failed. They must repent. Ask of religious leaders to call for national repentance and personal sacrifice. Let religious leaders donate 1 month's salary toward fund for Negro housing and education. I propose that you, Mr. President, declare state of moral emergency. A Marshall Plan for aid to Negroes is becoming a necessity. The hour calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. The hour calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. It is not enough, Heschel says, to simply try Gewalt, to cry out and say, this is wrong. It is not enough to issue formal declarations or preach sermons. I think about this in our social media era, in which it feels like it is doing something to post. Heschel would reach forward in time and say, posting is not change making. It is not enough to simply signal virtue and to speak the words, though I think he would say that starting by expressing oneself clearly as to what one believes is important. It just can't end there. We forfeit the right to worship God so long as this problem persists. Right? For Heschel, a person who is deeply religiously observant, a person who feels a sense of chiyuv, a sense of sacred, halachic, legal responsibility to pray. To say we forfeit the right to pray, our obligations are secondary, our spiritual obligations are secondary to our obligations to our neighbors. What this makes me think of is the set of Jewish laws that govern what one is supposed to do in the immediate hours and first days after someone has died. In Jewish tradition, we aim to bury as quickly as possible, and we start sitting Shiva after somebody has been returned to the earth. But the period of time between the death and the burial has itself a special name. That period of time is called Aninut. Aninut, the state of shock or the state of being overcome. And one of the features of Aninut is that during Aninut, one is exempted from all religious obligations, including the obligation to pray, so that one can fully attend to the needs of the dead, so that one can fully attend to taking care of what is most urgent in that hour, which is showing respect to the person who has died and returning them to the earth. I think Heschel is saying to President Kennedy, we are in a moment of aninut. We are in a moment in which we ought to feel overcome, in which we cannot engage in business as normal. Things have to be different because the world right now is on fire. He asks that religious institutions and religious leaders be involved and engaged on a personal level with trying to move the needle, to bend the arc, to change the present circumstance. And he asks President Kennedy to declare a state of moral emergency and to call out in all of us as collective citizens moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. And I'll ask us as we close this session to think about what it means to be in a state of moral emergency. What would that look like to collectively believe that we are needing to set aside the normal and in this emergency state, reorient our priorities? And what would be the moral grandeur and spiritual audacity that such an emergency situation would require of us individually and collectively? What are the moral and spiritual ramifications of recognizing that one is living in a time of moral emergency? And I think it is fair to say that were Heschel living today, he would certainly say that we are in a time of moral emergency. We are in a time that is very, very far from business as usual, and that we can't operate as usual under such circumstances, but that we have an opportunity in these times for the very best of us to come out, for our moral grandeur and spiritual audacity to be summoned to the fore to respond to the fire. And we are going to dig into Heschel's writings and thinking because they are a part of our collective treasure house of Jewish wisdom. But we are going to dig into Heschel's writing and thinking, particularly now at this hour of moral emergency, in order to find in ourselves how we can best respond with moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. And so we'll meet back here again next week, Wednesday. Please feel free to pop in and out as schedule allows. I'll be glad to see you whenever you're here. Please reach out with any feedback that you have from the first couple of sessions. I want to make this a learning experience that works for everybody. And I just want to thank you for being part of this group. It is very, very nourishing to me to see you all here. And I wish you a safe and peaceful week.
I had a question, if that's okay,
I'm not going
about the photograph. Who's
Yeah.
the guy holding the Torah? I mean, Heschel's on the other side of King. Is it Leo Beck? I mean, who is the person that's carrying the Torah?
Don't know the answer, but I can look into it for you.
I would love that. Thank you.
I will try to find out.
Appreciate that. This was great. Thank you so much.
Yasher Koach, Rabbi.
Yasher Koach, Rabbi,
Thank
and
you.
everybody.
Thank you
Thank
very much.
Thank you all for being here. Good night.
Thank you.